The words still echo in my mind even now, 15 years later. Stupid. Uneducated. Embarrassment. My own daughter, standing there in her cap and gown, looking at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. That day should have been filled with pride and celebration. Instead, it became the moment that changed everything between us. And honestly, it changed me too. What happened next? Well, that's a story worth telling. My name is Margaret Chen and I'm 62 years old. I grew up in a small apartment in San Francisco's Chinatown, the youngest of 5 children born to parents who had immigrated from Guangdong province in the late 1940s. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My father worked in a restaurant kitchen for 30 years, coming home every night smelling of cooking oil and sesame, his hands cracked from constant washing. My mother took in piecework sewing, her fingers moving so fast over fabric that I used to watch her in amazement, wondering how she never stabbed herself with the needle. Education wasn't something my family had the luxury to prioritize. My oldest brother made it through high school, but the rest of us had to leave school early to work and help support the family. I was 14 when I got my first real job at a garment factory, lying about my age, telling them I was 16. The supervisor knew I was lying, everyone did, but back in 1977, nobody asked too many questions if you were willing to work hard for low pay. I learned to operate an industrial sewing machine, my small hands perfect for the delicate work of finishing seams on expensive blouses destined for department stores downtown. The factory was in a building that always smelled like sizing and dust, with windows that barely opened and fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. There were about 40 of us working there, mostly immigrant women from China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. We spoke different languages, but we understood each other through gestures and the universal language of hard work. Mrs. Wong, who worked the machine next to mine, became like a second mother to me. She was the one who taught me not just how to sew faster, but how to spot quality fabric, how to recognize good construction, how to see the difference between something made with care and something rushed through for profit. I met David when I was 19. He was 23, working as a delivery driver for a medical supply company, bringing boxes to the clinic next door to our factory. He wasn't Chinese, he was white, and my parents were not happy about it at first. But David was kind and patient, and he didn't care that I had only finished 8th grade, or that my English wasn't perfect. He loved me for who I was, not for what diploma I did, or didn't have hanging on a wall. We got married in 1982 at City Hall, a simple ceremony with just a few friends and my reluctant family in attendance. David's parents had passed away years before, so it was just his sister Catherine who came from Seattle to stand with us. We rented a tiny studio apartment in the Sunset District, so small that our bed folded up into the wall during the day to make room for a table and 2 chairs. But it was ours, and we were happy. I kept working at the garment factory even after we married. David's salary was decent, but not enough for us to save much, especially once we started talking about having children. I worked overtime whenever I could, my fingers flying over fabric for 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. I was fast, one of the fastest finishers in the factory, and that meant I could take home a bit more in my paycheck. Our daughter Rachel was born in October of 1984. The moment they placed her in my arms, still red and crying, I felt something shift inside me. This tiny person, with her shock of black hair and her father's nose, represented possibility. Everything I hadn't been able to do, all the education I'd missed, all the opportunities that had passed me by, I would make sure she had access to them. I made that promise to her right there in that hospital room, while David dozed in the chair beside my bed, exhausted from staying awake through the entire labor. Money got tighter after Rachel was born. Childcare was expensive, more than we'd anticipated. My mother agreed to watch Rachel during the day, but she was getting older and her health wasn't great. I went back to work at the factory when Rachel was just 6 weeks old, my breasts leaking milk through my shirt during those first few weeks, having to pump in the bathroom during my lunch break. The other women understood. Most of them had been through the same thing. David picked up extra shifts when he could. Sometimes I wouldn't see him for days because our schedules were so opposite. He'd work nights and weekends, I'd work days and evenings. We'd leave notes for each other on the refrigerator, little messages about paying the electric bill or Rachel's doctor appointment, or how much we missed each other. Looking back now, those were hard years, but there was a sweetness to them too. We were young and tired and broke, but we were building something together. Rachel was a bright child from the beginning. She started talking early, full sentences by 18 months. She'd sit with my mother during the day, listening to Cantonese soap operas on the radio, and somehow she'd absorb both English and Cantonese simultaneously, switching between them without thinking. By the time she started kindergarten, the teachers were already saying she was advanced, that she had a gift for learning. I took every extra shift I could get. When the factory started getting contracts for higher-end boutiques, I volunteered for the most difficult pieces, the ones that required hand finishing and attention to detail. The pay was better, but the work was exhausting. I'd come home with my eyes burning from focusing on tiny stitches for hours, my shoulders aching from hunching over the machine. But when I'd see Rachel's report cards, all those marks of excellence, it felt worth it. David and I scripted and saved. We moved to a larger apartment when Rachel was 7, a 2-bedroom place in the Richmond district. It wasn't fancy, the building was old and the heating was unreliable, but Rachel had her own room. We bought her a desk from a thrift store, and David refinished it, sanding it down and painting it white. I sewed curtains for her window from leftover fabric I brought home from the factory, a cheerful yellow print with small flowers. That room became her sanctuary, walls covered with her drawings and school certificates. As Rachel got older, she became more aware of things. She noticed that her friends' mothers didn't work in factories, that they had jobs in offices or schools. She noticed that when parent-teacher conferences came around, I had to request time off, and sometimes couldn't make it because the factory wouldn't let me leave. She noticed that her friends went on vacations during summer while she stayed with my mother, or sometimes came with me to the factory on weekends, when I had to work overtime. I tried to explain to her why I worked so hard, why we couldn't afford the things some of her classmates had. But how do you explain to a child that you're sacrificing everything so she can have opportunities you never had? How do you make her understand that every hour you spend at that sewing machine is an investment in her future? When Rachel was in 6th grade, she came home one day and announced she wanted to apply to a private school for middle school. One of her teachers had suggested it, said there were scholarships available for promising students. David and I looked at each other across our small kitchen table that evening after Rachel had gone to bed. A private school? That world seemed so far from ours, so foreign. But if there were scholarships, if Rachel could get a better education than the public schools could provide, wasn't that what we'd been working toward? The application process was overwhelming. There were essays to write, recommendations to gather, tests to take. I couldn't help Rachel with the essays. My English wasn't good enough for that level of writing. David did his best, but he'd never been strong academically. So Rachel did most of it herself, staying up late at that white desk we'd bought her, working by the light of a lamp while I sewed in the living room and David was out making deliveries. She got in. Not just into one school but 3 of them. And one offered a substantial scholarship that would cover most of the tuition. I cried when we got the letter. David picked Rachel up and spun her around our small living room until they were both dizzy. This was it, we thought. This was the beginning of everything we'd hoped for. The private school was in Pacific Heights, a world away from our neighborhood both geographically and culturally. The building looked like something from a movie, all brick and ivy with a sweeping lawn and actual columns at the entrance. On Rachel's first day, I took time off from the factory to go with her and David. I wore my best dress, one I'd made myself from fabric Mrs. Wong had helped me choose, trying to look presentable among all these wealthy parents in their designer clothes. I could feel the looks we got. David in his work pants and button-up shirt, me in my homemade dress, both of us so obviously out of place among the lawyers and doctors and tech executives dropping off their children. But Rachel seemed to fit right in, her uniform neat, her backpack full of new supplies we'd saved for months to buy. She kissed us both goodbye and walked through those doors without looking back, and I felt proud and terrified in equal measure. The scholarship covered tuition, but there were so many other costs we hadn't anticipated. Field trips to museums and science centers, special supplies for art and music classes, fees for sports teams and clubs. Every month seemed to bring another request for money. Another opportunity we couldn't let Rachel miss because we knew she was already different enough from her classmates. I took on more overtime. David started working weekends regularly. We cut back on everything we could. I stopped buying new clothes entirely, just wore the same rotation of outfits I'd made years before. We never ate at restaurants anymore. Our television broke, and we didn't replace it for 2 years. Rachel thrived at the school academically. Her grades were excellent, always at the top of her class. But I started noticing changes in her. The way she'd correct my English at home, a hint of impatience in her voice. The way she'd ask me not to pack her lunch anymore because the other kids bought theirs from the cafeteria. The way she stopped inviting friends over to our apartment, making excuses about why they should meet somewhere else instead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When she was in 8th grade, there was a career day at her school. Parents were invited to come and talk about their professions. Rachel came home with the permission slip and handed it to me without meeting my eyes. I asked her if she wanted me to come, if she wanted me to talk about working in the garment industry. She was quiet for a long moment, then said maybe it would be better if David came instead, since he worked for a medical supply company, and that sounded more professional. I felt that rejection like a physical blow, but I told myself she was just a teenager, self-conscious like all kids that age. I told myself it would pass, that she'd grow out of this phase of being embarrassed by her mother. I signed the form for David to attend and said nothing about how much it hurt. High school brought more changes. Rachel was determined to get into a top university, and her school counselor supported that ambition. She needed to do everything perfectly, perfect grades, perfect test scores, perfect extracurricular activities. She joined the debate team, the science club, volunteered at a hospital on weekends. Our apartment became a place she barely inhabited, always rushing out to some activity or study group, coming home late to sleep, and then leave again early in the morning. David and I became like ghosts in her life, providers of money and transportation, and not much else. I tried to talk to her about her day, about her friends, about what she was learning, but her answers got shorter and shorter. Yes, no, fine, whatever. I told myself this was normal, that teenagers needed space from their parents, that she'd come back to us eventually. The college application process was intense. Rachel applied to 12 schools, each application costing money we didn't really have. But we paid it because this was the goal. This was what all those years of overtime and sacrifice had been building toward. She wrote her essays alone in her room, never asking for help, never sharing what she was writing about. I learned later, much later, that one of those essays was about overcoming adversity, about rising above her circumstances. At the time, I was proud that she had adversity to overcome. Proud that we'd given her something to rise above. She got into Stanford. A full scholarship covering tuition, room and board. When the acceptance letter came, Rachel actually screamed with joy, jumping around the apartment in a way I hadn't seen her do in years. David and I held each other in the kitchen, both of us crying, hardly believing that our daughter, our brilliant daughter, was going to one of the best universities in the country. The months before she left for college were strange. Rachel was excited, constantly talking about dorm life and classes and freedom. But there was something else too, a distance that had grown between us that I couldn't quite bridge. I tried making her favorite foods, tried sitting with her in the evenings to watch shows together, tried asking about her plans and her fears. But she was already gone and away, already living in a future that didn't include evening chats with her mother in a small Richmond district apartment. She left for Stanford in September of 2002. David drove her down with all her belongings packed into our old car. I had to work that day, couldn't get the time off, and Rachel said it was fine, that she preferred to say goodbye at home anyway. So I hugged her in our living room, breathing in the smell of her hair, trying to memorize the feel of her in my arms because I knew everything was changing. She pulled away quickly, impatient to get on the road, and I watched from our window as David loaded the car and they drove away. Those first few months were hard. The apartment felt too big and too quiet without Rachel's presence. I'd walk past her room and feel the absence like a weight. She called occasionally, brief conversations about classes and roommates and how busy she was. She came home for Thanksgiving but seemed distracted the whole time, texting friends, talking about people and places we didn't know. Christmas was better. She relaxed a bit, but I could feel her counting down the days until she could leave again. The years of college passed in a blur. Rachel came home less and less, choosing to stay on campus during breaks to take summer classes or internships. She was studying economics, she told us, with a minor in computer science. She wanted to work in finance or tech, wanted to make real money, wanted a different life than the one she'd grown up in. I understood that desire even as it hurt to hear it expressed so bluntly. David and I kept working. I was still at the garment factory, now in my 40s, my hands starting to show signs of arthritis from decades of repetitive motion. David's back was giving him trouble from all those years of lifting and carrying boxes. We weren't old yet, but we weren't young anymore either, and the work was getting harder. But we kept at it because that's what you do. You keep going. Rachel's senior year arrived, and with it, the announcement of graduation. The ceremony would be in May, outdoors on Stanford's campus. Rachel called to tell us the details, her voice excited. She'd been selected to give a speech as one of the top students in her class. We were so proud. David and I both got on the phone to tell her how amazing that was, how we couldn't wait to see her shine. I requested the day off from work months in advance, making sure nothing would prevent me from being there. I bought a new dress, the first piece of clothing I'd purchased for myself in years. It was simple but nice, navy blue with a modest neckline, and it fit well. I had my hair done at a salon in Chinatown the day before, something else I never did, but this was special. This was my daughter's graduation from Stanford University. David and I drove down together early that May morning. The campus was beautiful, sprawling and green with those iconic sandstone buildings glowing in the sunlight. Parents and graduates were everywhere, laughing and taking photos, everyone dressed up and celebratory. We found parking and made our way to the outdoor amphitheater where the ceremony would be held. That's when things started to feel wrong. We found seats near the middle, and I noticed people looking at us. Not friendly, curious looks, but assessing ones, the kind that take in your clothes and your face and make judgments. I smoothed down my dress, suddenly self-conscious, wondering if I'd made a mistake with my choice. David squeezed my hand, sensing my discomfort, and we sat down to wait for the ceremony to begin. Rachel had told us she'd find us afterward, that the graduates had to line up early and she wouldn't have time to see us before. So we watched as hundreds of students in caps and gowns filed into their seats, trying to spot Rachel among them. I finally saw her, sitting near the front because of her speech, and my heart swelled with pride. That was my daughter down there. My daughter who I'd rocked to sleep as a baby, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose homework I'd sat beside even when I couldn't help with it. My daughter who'd made it all the way to this moment. The ceremony began with speeches from administrators and faculty members. Then came the student speeches, and Rachel was third. She walked up to the podium with confidence, her posture perfect, her voice clear and strong when she began speaking. She talked about perseverance, about the importance of education, about how knowledge was the great equalizer in society. She talked about coming from humble beginnings and using that as motivation to succeed. I was listening so intently, so full of pride, that it took me a moment to register what she said next. She spoke about the importance of education in lifting people out of ignorance, about how she'd seen firsthand what lack of education could do to a person, how it limited their opportunities and their understanding of the world. She talked about breaking cycles and creating new paths, about not being held back by the limitations of previous generations. And then she said it. She said she'd grown up watching someone struggle because they'd never had the chance to get educated, someone who worked hard but would never advance because they simply didn't have the knowledge or skills to do more. She said it with sympathy in her voice, like she was telling a sad story about someone unfortunate. But I knew she was talking about me. Everyone sitting around me seemed to know it too, because I felt their eyes shifting toward me and David. The speech continued, but I'd stopped hearing it. My face felt hot, my hands were shaking in my lap. David put his arm around my shoulders, and I could feel he was tense beside me. When Rachel finished and everyone applauded, I clapped automatically, my hands coming together in mechanical movements while my mind reeled. After the ceremony ended, there was a reception on the lawn. Graduates mixed with families, everyone taking photos and congratulating each other. David and I stood awkwardly near a table of refreshments, not sure what to do or where to go. I saw Rachel across the lawn, surrounded by friends and their families, laughing and posing for pictures. She saw us too, I know she did, but she didn't come over. Finally, after what felt like hours, she made her way toward us. But she wasn't alone. She brought 3 friends with her, other graduates and their parents, well-dressed people with confident smiles. Rachel introduced us quickly, her voice bright but her eyes not quite meeting mine. "This is my mom and dad," she said, and then immediately turned the conversation to her friends, asking them about their summer plans, their job offers. One of the other mothers, a tall woman in an expensive-looking cream pantsuit, asked me what I did for work. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, Rachel jumped in. "She works in the garment industry," Rachel said quickly, "and my dad works in medical supplies." The way she said it, the slight emphasis on works in rather than with, the rush to move past it, I knew she was embarrassed. The conversation continued around me, but I was barely present for it. I was watching my daughter, seeing how she laughed with these other people, how she spoke differently, how she held herself differently. This wasn't my Rachel. Or maybe it was, and I just hadn't been willing to see how much she'd changed, how much distance she'd put between herself and us. David suggested we take a photo together, just the 3 of us. Rachel's smile tightened, but she agreed. We stood together on that perfect lawn, David and me on either side of our daughter in her cap and gown, and someone took our picture. In that photo, which I still have, you can see it if you look closely. The way Rachel's body is angled slightly away from me. The way her smile doesn't reach her eyes. The way she's already leaving even as she stands there. After the photo, Rachel said she had to go meet up with more friends, that she had plans for the evening. We asked if we could take her to dinner, our treat, a celebration. She hesitated, then said she'd already made plans with her roommates, that she'd see us the next day before we drove back to San Francisco. The dismissal was clear, polite but firm. We were being sent away. David and I went to a diner near campus for dinner, neither of us very hungry. We didn't talk much about the ceremony or the speech. What was there to say? We both knew what had happened, what Rachel had revealed about how she saw us, how she saw me. We ate our food quietly and drove to the cheap motel, where we'd booked a room for the night. The next morning, we met Rachel at a coffee shop near campus. She was wearing regular clothes now, jeans and a nice blouse, and she looked tired. The festivities had gone late, she explained. We sat at a small table, and I tried to think of something to say, some way to address what I'd felt during her speech, but every way I imagined starting that conversation seemed wrong. David filled the silence with questions about her plans. She'd accepted a job at a consulting firm in San Francisco, starting in August. She'd be living in the city, close to us geographically, but we all knew what that meant. Close in miles, distant in every other way. She was excited about the job, about the salary, about the opportunities for advancement. As she talked, I watched her face, animated and bright when discussing her future, and I felt something shift inside me. I'd spent 18 years making sacrifices for this moment. 18 years of overtime and sore hands and missed moments because I was working. 18 years of wearing the same old clothes and never taking vacations, and living small so Rachel could live big. And I'd done it gladly, had never resented a single moment of it, because I loved her, and wanted her to have every opportunity I'd never had. But sitting there in that coffee shop, watching her avoid eye contact with me, seeing how she checked her phone constantly like she was looking for an excuse to leave, I realized something painful. My sacrifices had given Rachel opportunities, yes, but they'd also given her permission to look down on me. By making my life so small, I'd taught her that my life had no value beyond what it could provide for her. By never demanding respect for my own work and struggles, I taught her that they weren't worthy of respect. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot. Rachel held me briefly, a quick squeeze and release. "Call us when you're settled," I said, and she nodded, already walking toward her friend's car. David and I watched her go. 2 middle-aged people in a parking lot, suddenly purposeless now that the goal we'd worked toward for so long had been achieved. The drive back to San Francisco was quiet. David tried to make conversation at first, commenting on the scenery, asking if I wanted to stop for lunch, but I couldn't find words to respond. My mind was turning over everything that had happened, everything that had been said and unsaid. The speech kept replaying in my head. Rachel's voice talking about breaking cycles and limitations, about not being held back by previous generations. When we got home, the apartment felt different. Rachel's room was still there, preserved like a shrine to her childhood, but she wasn't coming back to it. Not really. She might visit, might stay a night or two when convenient, but it wouldn't be her home anymore. That chapter was over. I stood in the doorway of her room, looking at the white desk David had refinished, the yellow flowered curtains I'd sewn, the walls covered with certificates and awards, evidence of a childhood we'd poured everything into. I went to work the next day like normal. Sat at my sewing machine, did my job, came home. David went to work, came home. We fell back into our routine, but something had broken. Not between us. David and I were solid as ever. But something in me had broken, some understanding of how the world worked, some belief about what my life meant. Mrs. Wong noticed I wasn't myself. During our lunch break, she asked if something was wrong, if the graduation hadn't gone well. I told her it went fine, that Rachel gave a speech and graduated with honors and got a good job. Mrs. Wong looked at me with knowing eyes, the kind that come from decades of watching people, and said sometimes our children grow into people we don't recognize, but that doesn't mean we failed them. It just means they grew. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that Rachel's distance, her embarrassment, her casual cruelty in that speech, were just signs of her growing into her own person. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, I taught her the wrong lessons. I taught her that sacrifice equaled love, that my worth was measured entirely by what I could provide for her, that my life only mattered in context of hers. The weeks after graduation passed slowly. Rachel moved into her apartment in San Francisco, a nice place in Soma that her new job's signing bonus helped her afford. She invited us over once. A brief tour that made it clear we were guests in her space, not family who were always welcome. The apartment was sleek and modern, nothing like the cluttered warmth of our place. It looked like something from a magazine, impersonal and perfect. She started her job and became consumed by it, working long hours, networking, building her career. The calls became less frequent, down to maybe once every 2 weeks, and they were always brief. Just checking in, she'd say, but her voice was distracted, and I could hear her typing in the background like she was doing other things while talking to me. I'd ask about her life, her job, if she was eating well and getting enough sleep, and she'd give short answers before finding a reason to end the call. David tried to be philosophical about it. She's busy, he'd say. She's starting her career. This is an important time for her. She'll come around when things settle down. And maybe he was right. Maybe this was just a phase, temporary distance while Rachel established herself in her new life. But it didn't feel temporary. It felt final, like a door closing. I kept working at the factory, my hands moving automatically through the familiar motions, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about all those years of sacrifice, replaying moments and wondering where it went wrong. Was it when I couldn't help with her homework, because I didn't have the education? Was it when she started at that private school, and saw how different other families were? Was it gradual, a slow accumulation of small embarrassments? Or was there a specific moment when she decided I wasn't good enough? 3 months after graduation, in August, Rachel called to say she couldn't make it to Sunday dinner. It was a tradition we'd kept even through her college years, Sunday dinners together when she was in town, but she'd missed the last 2 and now was canceling a third. She had a work event, she said, important networking. I understand, I told her, even though I didn't, even though work events on Sunday evenings seemed like a convenient excuse. That Sunday, David and I ate dinner alone. Too much food for just 2 people because I'd cooked like Rachel was coming. We sat at our small table, the empty chair a presence between us. After dinner, while David watched television, I went into Rachel's old room and sat at that white desk. I ran my hands over the surface, remembering David sanding it smooth, painting it carefully. I looked at the yellow curtains, remembering cutting the fabric, sewing the seams. And that's when I made a decision. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet or how I would do it, but I knew I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep waiting for my daughter to remember I existed. Couldn't keep measuring my worth by how much I could sacrifice for someone who saw that sacrifice as something to overcome rather than something to honor. I'd spent my whole adult life making myself small so Rachel could be big. It was time to figure out who I was beyond being her mother, beyond being the uneducated factory worker she was embarrassed to claim. I was 45 years old, no high school diploma, no skills beyond sewing and keeping a household running on almost nothing. But I was also strong and capable and smarter than my lack of formal education suggested. I'd managed a family budget for decades, taught myself to read well enough to help with elementary school homework, learned enough about fabrics and construction to be one of the best finishers at my factory. I'd built a life from nothing, raised a daughter who got into Stanford. That took intelligence, resourcefulness, determination. Sitting in Rachel's room that evening, I started thinking about what I wanted. Not what Rachel needed or what David needed, or what would make everyone else happy. What did I, Margaret Chen, want for my own life? The question felt strange, almost selfish, because I'd never really asked it before. My wants had always been filtered through other people, shaped by their needs and expectations. But now I was asking. And slowly, an answer started to form. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. David was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady and even. I got up quietly, made coffee, and sat at our small kitchen table with a notebook I'd found in Rachel's old desk. The pages were blank, waiting. I started writing down everything I was good at. Not things I'd done for other people, but actual skills I possessed. I could sew anything from a simple hem to a complex tailored jacket. I understood fabric properties, how different materials draped and wore. I could look at a garment and deconstruct it in my mind, seeing how it was put together. I knew how to manage money carefully, stretching every dollar. I could cook elaborate meals from minimal ingredients. I spoke 3 languages, Cantonese, Mandarin, and English, even if my English wasn't perfect. Writing it all down felt strange, almost boastful, but also liberating. These were real abilities, valuable in their own right, not just in what they could provide for someone else. I'd spent so long thinking of myself only as Rachel's mother or David's wife or a factory worker that I'd forgotten I was a complete person with my own capabilities. That week, I started paying attention differently at the factory. I watched how the business operated, not just my small part in it but the whole system. The owner, Mr. Huang, was getting older and had been talking about wanting to slow down. The factory had been struggling with some of the larger contracts, quality issues that kept coming up because the newer workers weren't as skilled. I saw inefficiencies in how work was distributed, how materials were stored, how orders were processed. During lunch one day, I mentioned to Mrs. Wang that I'd been thinking about the factory's problems. She looked at me with surprise, then interest. In all the years we'd worked together, I'd never commented on the business side of things. But now I had ideas, things I'd noticed from my position on the floor that management seemed oblivious to. What if we reorganized the workflow so experienced sewers were paired with newer ones? I suggested. Not formally like trainers, but positioned so they could help and catch mistakes early. What if we implemented a quality check at each stage instead of just at the end when it was too late to fix things efficiently? What if we negotiated better rates with our fabric suppliers by committing to longer-term contracts? Mrs. Wang listened carefully, nodding. These are good thoughts, she said. You should talk to Mr. Huang. I laughed, imagining myself, a line worker with no education, approaching the owner with business suggestions. But Mrs. Wang was serious. You've been here almost 30 years, Margaret. You know this place better than anyone. He'd be a fool not to listen. I didn't approach Mr. Huang right away. Instead, I spent the next few weeks observing even more carefully, taking notes during my breaks, documenting specific examples of the problems I'd identified and potential solutions. I talked to other workers, getting their perspectives and ideas. Slowly, a comprehensive proposal took shape. Meanwhile, Rachel's absence in our lives became more pronounced. She missed David's birthday in September with barely an apology, sending a card that arrived 3 days late. When I called to check in, she sounded harassed and distracted. Work was demanding, she said. Her boss expected long hours. She was learning so much, but it was exhausting. I understood demanding work, had lived it my whole life, but I couldn't help feeling that she could make time if she wanted to. She was choosing not to. In October, on what would have been Rachel's 20th birthday, we invited her to dinner. She declined, saying she had plans with work friends. David looked hurt but said nothing. I felt something harden in my chest, a protective callus forming over the wound of her rejection. Fine, I thought. If she doesn't want to be part of this family, if she's embarrassed by us, then I'll stop waiting for her to remember we exist. That hardness, that new shell, gave me courage. The following Monday, I asked to speak with Mr. Huang. His secretary seemed surprised but scheduled me for the end of the day. I was nervous, my hands shaking slightly as I entered his office with my notebook full of observations and ideas. Mr. Huang was a stern man in his late 60s, always serious and focused on numbers. He looked up from his desk with mild curiosity when I entered. "Margaret," he said, "what can I do for you?" I took a deep breath and began presenting my ideas, speaking carefully but firmly. I showed him my documentation, explained the problems I'd identified, outlined my proposed solutions with projected cost savings and quality improvements. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, there was a long silence. I was certain he was going to dismiss me, tell me to get back to my sewing machine, and leave the business decisions to people who knew what they were doing. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "A few months," I admitted. "But really, I've been seeing these problems for years. I just never thought it was my place to say anything." He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've been looking for someone to take on more responsibility here, someone who understands the work from the ground up. Most of the young people I hire, they know business theory but they don't know garments. They don't know the work. You know the work." My heart started beating faster. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to implement these ideas," he replied. "I'll make you a floor supervisor, give you authority to reorganize the workflow and implement quality controls. We'll try it for 3 months and see if your projections are accurate. If they are, we'll talk about expanding your role further." I left his office in a daze. A supervisor position meant more responsibility but also more pay, better hours, and most importantly, recognition that I had value beyond my ability to operate a sewing machine quickly. When I told David that evening, he picked me up and spun me around our small kitchen just like he'd done when Rachel got into Stanford, and I laughed with genuine joy for the first time in months. The next 3 months were intense. I implemented changes carefully, knowing the other workers were watching skeptically. Who did I think I was, suddenly giving orders after being one of them for so long? But I made sure to explain every change, to ask for input, to give credit where it was due. Slowly, the resistance faded as people saw that my ideas actually worked. Quality improved. Productivity increased. Mr. Huang started getting compliments from clients about the recent uptick in consistency. Rachel called in November, a brief conversation where she mentioned she might not be able to make it home for Thanksgiving. Her firm was working on a major project with a tight deadline. I could hear her waiting for me to protest, to guilt her into coming, but I didn't. "That's fine," I said simply. "David and I will do something quiet." There was a pause, like she'd expected a different response. Then she said okay and quickly ended the call. David was disappointed about Thanksgiving, but I suggested we do something different this year. Instead of cooking an elaborate meal for just the two of us, what if we volunteered at one of the community centers in Chinatown that served Thanksgiving dinner to people who had nowhere else to go? He agreed immediately, always generous with his time when it came to helping others. We spent Thanksgiving serving food and talking with people who reminded me that there were struggles bigger than my daughter's rejection. Elderly immigrants who'd never learned English, living alone in tiny rooms. Families who'd fallen on hard times, trying to maintain dignity while accepting charity. Young people who'd been kicked out by their families for various reasons. My problems suddenly seemed smaller, more manageable. One woman I talked to while serving sweet potatoes was probably in her 70s, tiny and frail with hands gnarled by arthritis. She thanked me in Cantonese and we started chatting. She'd worked in garment factories too, for over 40 years, and was now living on minimal social security in a single room. No family, she said. I had a daughter once, but we don't speak anymore. She wanted a different life. And I reminded her of everything she wanted to escape. The similarity to my own situation was painfully clear, but there was also a difference. I still had time to make sure my life didn't end up as just a sad story about sacrifice and abandonment. I still had the capacity to build something for myself, to become someone beyond Rachel's embarrassed mother. December came and my 3-month trial period ended. Mr. Huang called me into his office again, this time with a smile on his usually stern face. The numbers were even better than my projections, he said. Quality complaints were down 60%, productivity was up 25%, and we'd retained 2 major clients who'd been considering leaving. He offered me a permanent position as production manager with a substantial raise, and the authority to hire an assistant to help implement further improvements. I accepted, of course, but more than the title or the money, what mattered was the proof that I was capable of more than I'd believed. That my lack of formal education didn't mean I lacked intelligence or valuable skills. That my life could have meaning and purpose beyond serving other people's ambitions. Rachel came home for Christmas after all, arriving Christmas Eve and planning to leave the day after. She seemed surprised by the changes in me, the new confidence, the way I talked about my work with enthusiasm. Over Christmas dinner, she asked about the promotion almost dismissively, like she was humoring me by showing interest. That's great, Mom, she said, her tone suggesting it wasn't particularly great at all. Still at the same factory, though. Yes, I replied evenly. Still at the same factory where I've worked for 30 years, and now manage the entire production floor. It's actually quite satisfying to implement changes and see real results. She looked at me oddly, perhaps noticing something different in my tone. The absence of the apologetic quality I used to have when talking about my work. The conversation moved on, but I caught her studying me a few times during the evening like she was trying to figure out what had changed. The day after Christmas, before she left, Rachel and I had a moment alone while David was out getting gas for her drive back to the city. She was packing her bag, moving quickly, eager to leave. I stood in the doorway of her old room watching. You seem different, she said, not looking at me. Do I replied. More confident or something. She zipped her bag with more force than necessary. It's good, I guess. I almost let it go, almost let her leave without saying what needed to be said. But the old Margaret, the one who stayed quiet and accepted crumbs of attention, she wasn't here anymore. The new Margaret, the one who'd spoken up at work and changed her circumstances, she had things to say. Rachel, I began, and something in my voice made her stop and look at me. I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. She set down her bag, her expression guarded. Okay. Your graduation speech, I continued, my voice steady despite my racing heart. When you talked about people being limited by lack of education, about breaking cycles, I know you were talking about me. Maybe you didn't mean it cruelly, maybe you thought you were just being honest about your journey, but it hurt. It hurt deeply. Mom, I didn't mean, she started, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. I've spent the last few months thinking about what you said, about how you see me, about what my life has meant. And I've realized something important. My lack of formal education doesn't make me stupid or ignorant. It makes me someone who had different circumstances, who made different choices. I left school to help support my family. I worked hard my entire life. I raised you. Gave you every opportunity one could. Sacrificed so you could have what I didn't. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to honor. Rachel's face had gone pale. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. But you were embarrassed by me, I said quietly. You are embarrassed by me. The way you introduce me to your friends, the way you avoid having us visit you, the way you've distanced yourself from us since you went to college. I see it all, Rachel. I'm not stupid. She looked away, tears forming in her eyes, but I wasn't done. I love you more than anything in this world, I continued. I would do everything the same all over again if it meant giving you the opportunities you've had. But I'm done apologizing for who I am. I'm done making myself small so you can feel big. I'm done waiting for you to remember we exist. I have value, Rachel. My life has meaning beyond being your mother. And if you can't see that, If you can't respect the sacrifices I made and the person I am, then that's your loss, not mine. The words hung in the air between us. Rachel was crying now, silent tears running down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know you are, I said. But sorry isn't enough. I need you to think about why you're sorry, about what you're sorry for. And I need you to decide what kind of relationship you want with us going forward. Because I'm not going to chase after you anymore, begging for scraps of your time and attention. You know where we are. You know we love you. But from now on, you need to meet us halfway. I left her room and went to the kitchen, my hands shaking from the adrenaline of finally saying what needed to be said. A few minutes later, I heard her leave with David, their goodbye brief. When David came back, he found me sitting at the table, staring at nothing. You okay? He asked, sitting down beside me. I told her how I felt, I said. About the speech, about everything. He took my hand, squeezed it. How did she take it? She cried. She apologized. But I don't know if she really understood. I paused, organizing my thoughts. I told her I wasn't going to chase after her anymore. That she needs to decide what kind of relationship she wants with us. David was quiet for a moment, then nodded. You did the right thing. We've been so focused on making her happy, on not burdening her, that we forgot we deserve respect too. The weeks after that conversation were strange. Rachel didn't call, and I didn't call her either. It felt wrong at first, this absence of contact, but also oddly peaceful. I focused on my work, on implementing new systems at the factory, on training my new assistant who turned out to be a bright young woman recently arrived from Taiwan. Her name was Lynn, and she reminded me of myself at that age. Eager to work hard but unsure of her capabilities. I made it my mission to mentor Lynn properly, to teach her not just the technical skills, but the business acumen I'd developed. I shared my observations, explained my decision-making process, encouraged her to speak up with her own ideas. She blossomed under the attention, and watching her grow gave me a satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. This was meaningful work, passing on knowledge, helping someone else develop their potential. In January, I enrolled in an adult education class at the community college. Basic business management, nothing fancy, but it was something I'd never allowed myself to do before. The first night of class, sitting in a room full of people of all ages, many of them immigrants like me working to improve their circumstances, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never experienced before. These were my peers, people who valued learning regardless of their starting point. The instructor was a woman in her 40s who'd started her own successful consulting business, after working her way up from an entry-level position. She spoke about the value of practical experience combined with theoretical knowledge, about how formal education was just one type of learning. I thought about Rachel's speech again, about her emphasis on education as the great equalizer, and I realized she'd gotten it wrong. Education was valuable, yes, but wisdom came from many sources. Experience taught things no classroom could. I threw myself into the coursework with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. The concepts weren't as foreign as I'd feared. Much of what we covered, I'd already been doing intuitively for years. But now I had vocabulary for it, frameworks to organize my thinking, validation that my approaches were sound. My grades were excellent, and the instructor asked if I'd consider continuing on toward a certificate, or even a degree. A degree. Me at 46 years old, thinking about getting a degree. It seemed absurd, but also why not? Who said learning had an age limit? Who said I couldn't start now, late but not too late, working towards something for myself? February passed, then March. Rachel's birthday came in early April, and I sent a card and a small gift but didn't call. David asked if I wanted to reach out, maybe invite her to dinner, but I reminded him what I'd said. She knows where we are. If she wants contact, she can initiate it. In late April, my phone rang at work. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. My heart jumped, but I let it ring through to voicemail. I was in a meeting with Mr. Huang and 2 potential new clients, presenting our quality control systems and production capabilities. This was important, and I wasn't going to interrupt it for someone who'd made clear I was a low priority in her life. After the meeting, which went well and resulted in a promising new contract, I listened to her message. Mom, it's me. I was just calling to say hi, see how you're doing. I haven't heard from you in a while. Could you call me back when you get a chance? Her voice sounded uncertain, maybe a little hurt by my silence. I didn't call back that day. Or the next. On the third day, I finally returned her call, timing it for my lunch break, limiting the conversation by the constraints of my schedule. She answered on the first ring. Mom, hi. I've been trying to reach you. I know, I said calmly. I've been busy with work. We landed a major new client, and I'm overseeing the setup of their production line. Oh, that's great. A pause. I wanted to talk to you about something. What's that? About what you said at Christmas. I've been thinking about it a lot. She sounded nervous, words coming fast. You were right. I have been embarrassed, and that's terrible. You sacrificed everything for me, and I repaid you by acting like you were something to overcome instead of someone to honor. I waited, saying nothing, letting her continue. I talked to my therapist about it, she went on, and I was seeing a therapist now, apparently, and she helped me understand that I was projecting my own insecurities onto you. I was so afraid of being seen as poor or undereducated, or not belonging in these elite spaces that I rejected the parts of my background that reminded me of those fears. But in doing that, I rejected you. And that's unforgivable. It's not unforgivable, I said quietly. But it is hurtful. And it needs to change if we're going to have a real relationship. I know. I want to change. I want to do better. She paused, then added softly, I miss you, Mom. I miss Dad. I miss feeling like part of a family instead of just this isolated person focused only on career and status. The words touched something deep inside me, but I didn't let myself cave completely. Words are easy, Rachel. Actions are what matter. Show me you mean this. Make time for us. Visit because you want to, not out of obligation. Stop being embarrassed by who we are and where you come from. I will, she promised. I am. Can I come over this weekend? I want to see you both, spend real time together. No rushing off, no distractions. We'd like that, I said and meant it. But I was cautious too, protecting the progress I'd made, the self-worth I'd rebuilt. One conversation didn't erase months of hurt and years of accumulated distance. That weekend, Rachel came over on Saturday morning and stayed until Sunday evening. It was different than her previous visits. She asked about my work with genuine interest, listening carefully as I explained the new systems I'd implemented and the business class I was taking. She helped make dinner, something she hadn't done since high school, laughing as she fumbled with the wok because she'd forgotten how to stir-fry properly. She told us about her job, but this time she also admitted it was harder than she'd expected, that the prestige came with crushing pressure and a work culture that demanded everything while giving little back. She was good at her job, was already being considered for promotion, but she was also exhausted and starting to question whether this was really what she wanted for her life. On Sunday morning, we all went to dim sum in Chinatown, something we used to do regularly when Rachel was young. Sitting in the bustling restaurant, watching Rachel navigate the carts and order in Cantonese that was rusty but still functional, I felt a fragile hope. Maybe this could be repaired. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. But I also knew it wouldn't be the same as before. I wasn't the same person who'd accepted whatever crumbs of attention Rachel offered. I had my own life now, my own goals, my own sense of worth that didn't depend on her validation. If she wanted to be part of my life, truly part of it, she needed to respect that life and the person I was. Over the next few months, Rachel made efforts. She called weekly, actual conversations, not just quick check-ins. She came to visit at least twice a month, sometimes staying overnight in her old room. She asked David about his work, his hobbies, the things he was interested in beyond just his role as her father. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt connection. In June, something unexpected happened. Mr. Huang announced he was finally ready to retire, and he wanted to sell the factory. He'd had offers from larger companies, he told the staff, but he wanted to find a buyer who would preserve the business rather than just absorb it and lay everyone off. He looked directly at me when he said this, and I realized what he was suggesting before he even asked. Would you consider buying it? He asked me privately after the announcement. I have savings I could invest, and I know you could make this place thrive. I'd sell to you at a fair price, with terms that would make it manageable. Buy the factory. The idea was overwhelming and terrifying and thrilling all at once. I'd been managing it successfully for months, had ideas for expansion and improvement, knew every aspect of the operation. But ownership was different. That was risk, responsibility, a commitment to not just myself but to all the people who worked there. I talked to David that night, laying out the opportunity and the challenges. We'd need to take out a loan, use our savings, maybe even mortgage our apartment. If it failed, we could lose everything. But if it succeeded, if I could really make a go of this, it could change our lives completely. David looked at me across our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals and conversations over the years, and smiled. "You can do this," he said with absolute certainty. "You've already been doing it. This just makes it official. I believe in you, Margaret." That faith, that unconditional support, it meant everything. I'd spent so long seeking validation from Rachel, measuring my worth by her success, that I'd almost forgotten I had a partner who'd always believed in me, who'd never seen my lack of education as a limitation. I spent the next week putting together a business plan, working late into the nights, researching loans and projections and market opportunities. Rachel, hearing about the potential purchase, offered to help. She had business training I lacked, access to resources through her firm. At first, I was hesitant to accept, not wanting to give her another opportunity to see me as less capable, but she approached it differently this time. "Mom, you know this business inside and out," she said, sitting with me at that kitchen table, papers spread everywhere. "I can help with the financial modeling and loan applications, but this is your expertise, your vision. I'm just support staff." That shift, that recognition of my knowledge and her supporting role, it marked a real change in our dynamic. We worked together for hours, Rachel translating my practical knowledge into business language that banks would understand, me providing the substance and vision that made the proposal compelling. The loan application process was grueling, interview after interview with skeptical bankers who looked at my age, my gender, my lack of formal business education and saw risk. But my track record spoke for itself. The factory's improved performance under my management, the new contracts I'd secured, the employee retention rates, the quality improvements. Numbers didn't lie, and the numbers were excellent. In August, exactly 1 year after Rachel had started her job and begun drifting away from us, I got the call that the loan was approved. With Mr. Huang's willingness to finance part of the purchase himself and hold some equity for the first few years, the deal was possible. By September, the papers were signed. I owned a garment factory. The day of the signing, Rachel asked if she could be there. Not to participate, just to witness this moment. I agreed, and when I signed my name on that final document, making me the owner of Chun Manufacturing, formerly Huang Garment Factory, I looked up to see her crying. These were different tears than at Christmas. These were tears of pride, of recognition, of finally seeing her mother as a complete person rather than just a source of support for her own ambitions. The celebration afterward was small, just David, Rachel, Mrs. Wang Lin and a few other key employees at a modest restaurant in Chinatown. But it felt significant, marking not just a business transaction but a transformation. I gave a short speech, thanking everyone who'd supported me, especially David for his unwavering belief, and Mrs. Wang for her friendship and wisdom over 3 decades. Rachel asked if she could say something. I nodded, curious and slightly anxious about what she might say. She stood, looking around the table, then at me. "Most of you know I'm Margaret's daughter," she began. "What you might not know is that for a long time, I took her for granted. I saw her sacrifices as obligations rather than gifts. I was embarrassed by her lack of formal education, instead of respecting the wisdom she'd gained through experience. I measured her worth by society's narrow standards instead of recognizing her true value." She paused, emotion thickening her voice. "A year ago, at my graduation, I gave a speech about breaking cycles and overcoming limitations. I thought I was talking about rising above my circumstances. But really, I was just being cruel to the person who'd given me everything. My mother called me out on it, made me face how I was treating her. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had, but it was necessary." Rachel looked directly at me now. "Mom, watching you this past year has taught me more than 4 years at Stanford ever did. You identified a problem, developed solutions, took risks, and completely changed your circumstances. You went back to school at 46 without letting pride or fear stop you. You negotiated with banks and lawyers and business partners without formal training, but with intelligence and determination. You're the most successful entrepreneur I know, and I'm honored to be your daughter. I couldn't speak, throat too tight with emotion. David squeezed my hand under the table. Around us, people were clapping, wiping their own eyes. This moment, this public acknowledgement from my daughter, it healed something that had been broken. After the dinner, walking back to our car with David and Rachel, I felt complete in a way I hadn't in years. Not because Rachel had validated me, though that mattered, but because I'd validated myself. I'd proven to myself that I was capable, valuable, worthy of respect. Rachel's recognition was wonderful, but it was confirmation of what I already knew rather than the source of my self-worth. The factory thrived under my ownership. I implemented more of the changes I'd been planning, expanded into new markets, hired more workers including several women in situations similar to mine had been, single mothers and immigrants looking for opportunity. I made sure to pay fair wages, provide good working conditions, treat employees with dignity. The business grew steadily, not explosive growth but sustainable expansion built on quality and reliability. Rachel continued her job at the consulting firm, but with a different attitude. She set boundaries, worked hard during work hours but protected her personal time. She visited regularly, called frequently, rebuilt her relationship not just with me but with David. She dated someone for a while, brought him to meet us, asked our opinions. The relationship didn't last, but the fact that she'd wanted our input, had valued our perspective, that meant something. My business classes continued, one course at a time, working toward that certificate and eventually maybe a degree. Not because I needed it for my career, I was already successful, but because I wanted it for myself. Because learning was valuable in its own right, because growth didn't stop at any particular age. 2 years after buying the factory, we moved out of our old apartment into a small house in the Sunset District, nothing fancy but ours, with a yard and space for David's growing collection of woodworking tools. He'd discovered a passion for carpentry, taking classes at the community center, creating beautiful furniture in our garage. We were building lives that were about more than just working to support other people's dreams. We had our own dreams now. Rachel came to our housewarming party, helping set up and talking easily with our mix of guests, factory workers, business class classmates, old friends, new colleagues. At one point, I overheard her talking to Lynn, my assistant who was now being groomed to eventually take over day-to-day operations. "Your mom is amazing," Rachel was saying. The way she transformed her career, started her own business, just decided she was capable of more, and made it happen. I'm trying to learn from her example, figure out what I actually want instead of just chasing status and money. Lynn nodded enthusiastically. "She's the best teacher I've ever had. She makes you believe you can do anything if you're willing to work for it." Standing in my new home, listening to my daughter and my protégé discuss me with genuine admiration, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any I'd experienced at Rachel's graduation or any of her achievements. This was my success, built through my own efforts, recognized on its own merits. I'd started as that frightened girl leaving school at 14, become the factory worker whose daughter was ashamed of her, and transformed into a business owner, a mentor, a student, a woman who knew her own worth. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more opportunities to grow and learn. But I faced them now with confidence, knowing I had value beyond what I could provide for others, knowing my life had meaning in its own right. Rachel's graduation and her cruel words had hurt deeply, but they'd also been a catalyst, forcing me to examine my life and make changes I should have made years earlier. Sometimes the hardest moments become the greatest gifts if we have the courage to learn from them instead of just suffering through them. 5 years passed, each one bringing new growth and unexpected joys. The factory expanded twice, first adding a second floor to our original building, then opening a smaller satellite location in Oakland. We specialize now in sustainable fashion, working with organic fabrics and ethical production methods, a niche market that aligned with my values and attracted clients willing to pay premium prices for quality and conscience. Rachel left her consulting job in her 3rd year there, burned out and searching for something more meaningful. She took time off, traveled to Asia, reconnected with our family's roots in Guangdong province. When she returned, she seemed lighter somehow, less driven by external markers of success, and more interested in internal satisfaction. She started working for a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for immigrant communities, using her business skills to help people like my parents had been, navigating systems that weren't designed for them. The shift in her career meant less money but more purpose. And I watched her become someone I genuinely admired, not just loved out of obligation. She volunteered to teach basic business classes at the same community college where I'd started my education journey. Sometimes we'd meet there between her classes and mine, grabbing coffee and talking about our students, sharing the satisfaction of watching people discover their own capabilities. David retired from the medical supply company at 60, his back finally giving him too much trouble to continue the physical demands of delivery work. But retirement suited him. He turned his woodworking hobby into a small business, creating custom furniture pieces that sold through local galleries and word of mouth. Our garage became his workshop, always smelling of sawdust and wood stain, and he'd spend hours there creating beautiful things with the same hands that had worked so hard for so many years to support our family. I completed my business certificate and kept going, earning an associate degree at 51. The graduation ceremony was small, nothing like Stanford's grandeur, but Rachel and David were there cheering louder than anyone when I walked across that stage. Rachel took more photos that day than she had at her own graduation, posting them proudly on social media with captions about her mother's achievement. The reversal wasn't lost on either of us. Mrs. Wong retired at 70, and we threw her a party at the factory that she claimed was too much fuss but clearly loved. She pulled me aside during the celebration, her weathered hands holding mine tightly. "I always knew you had this in you," she said. "I just had to wait for you to know it too." Lynn took over as production manager, running daily operations with efficiency and innovation that sometimes surpassed my own. I focused more on business development, client relationships, and strategic planning. We made a good team, her technical excellence complementing my experience and vision. I made sure she was paid well, given credit for her contributions, treated as the valuable professional she was. I remembered too clearly what it felt like to be invisible, to have your work matter but not your worth. Rachel met someone new, a teacher named Michael who worked at an elementary school in the Mission District. He was kind and patient, genuinely interested in her family and background, and when he met us for the first time, he asked thoughtful questions about our lives and listened carefully to the answers. They got engaged after a year of dating, and Rachel asked if we could have the engagement party at our house, wanting her two worlds to merge rather than keeping them separate. The party filled our home with an eclectic mix of people, Rachel's nonprofit colleagues and Michael's teacher friends mixing with my factory workers and David's woodworking clients. I watched Rachel move through the crowd, comfortable in her own skin, introducing her fiancé to Mrs. Wong, and explaining my business to Michael's parents with pride in her voice. This was healing made visible, relationships rebuilt on foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The wedding was planned for the following spring, a small ceremony in Golden Gate Park followed by a reception at a restaurant in Chinatown. Rachel asked me to help her choose the fabric for her dress, wanted something that honored our family's history in the garment industry. We spent an afternoon at fabric suppliers, touching silks and satins, discussing drape and sheen, and I taught her what Mrs. Wong had taught me decades ago about recognizing quality. We found a beautiful silk in a shade of ivory that caught the light perfectly. "I'll make your dress," I offered, the words coming out before I'd fully thought them through. "If you want me to." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I was hoping you'd offer," she admitted. "I couldn't imagine anyone else doing it." I spent months on that dress, every stitch placed with care and love. It was the most important garment I'd ever create, more meaningful than any of the thousands of pieces I'd produced over my career. Rachel came for fittings, and we'd stand in my sewing room, her in the partially completed dress and me pinning and adjusting, talking about everything and nothing. These quiet hours together, working toward this shared goal, they completed the healing that had started 5 years earlier. The night before the wedding, Rachel stayed at our house in her old room. We sat up late talking, just the two of us, in a way we hadn't since she was small. She asked about my life, really asked, wanting to know about my dreams and regrets, my hopes and fears, seeing me as a complete person rather than just her mother. I told her about leaving school at 14, about the shame I'd carried for years over my lack of education. I told her about the early days with David, how poor we'd been but how happy. I told her about the decision to sacrifice everything for her opportunities, and how I'd do it again but would also make sure to preserve more of myself in the process. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that surprised me. I used to think your life was small, she admitted. That you'd settled, accepted less than you deserved. But now I understand that you built something real and solid, that you created value and meaning through your work and your relationships. My life looked bigger from the outside, the prestigious school and the high-paying job, but it was hollow. You taught me that size doesn't matter if there's no substance. The wedding day was perfect, sunny and warm with a gentle breeze. Rachel looked stunning in the dress I'd made. And when Michael saw her walking toward him through the redwood grove, his face showed such pure love and joy that I cried despite my intention to stay composed. David held my hand throughout the ceremony, both of us thinking about our own wedding decades ago. How young and naive we'd been. How much we'd learned and grown together. During the reception, Rachel gave a speech thanking everyone for coming, thanking Michael for choosing her, thanking his family for welcoming her. Then she turned to where David and I sat. And most of all, she said, her voice strong and clear, I want to thank my parents. Mom and Dad, you gave me everything. Not just opportunities and education, but examples of how to live with integrity and determination. Mom, you taught me that it's never too late to change your life, that worth isn't measured by diplomas or titles, but by how you treat people and what you build with your own hands. You showed me real strength, real courage. Everything good in me comes from you both. The words were public validation of what I already knew privately, but they mattered nonetheless. Not because I needed Rachel's approval to know my own worth, but because they represented her complete acceptance of who we were, who I was, without shame or reservation. After the wedding, life settled into a new rhythm. Rachel and Michael bought a small house in the Excelsior, close enough that Sunday dinners became regular again, but now with Michael and eventually with grandchildren. The first one, a daughter they named Margaret after me, arrived 2 years after the wedding. Holding her for the first time, seeing my name carried forward, understanding that this child would grow up knowing her grandmother as a business owner and college graduate, not just a factory worker, I felt the circle complete. I taught little Margaret to sew when she was 5, her small hands learning to guide fabric just as mine had learned from my mother, just as my mother's had learned from hers. The skill passed down through generations, but now accompanied by education, opportunity, choice. She could be anything she wanted, and if she chose to work with fabric and thread, it would be because she loved it, not because she had no other options. The factory continued to thrive, becoming known for quality and ethical practices. We won awards, got featured in articles about sustainable fashion, attracted clients who valued our approach. I hired more people, created more opportunities, made sure that the women who worked for me understood their value and had paths to advancement. Some followed trajectories similar to mine, starting on the floor and rising to management. Others used the job as a stepping stone to other dreams, and I supported that too, understanding that not everyone's path was the same. On my 60th birthday, my family and friends threw me a surprise party at the factory. The space was transformed with decorations and a catered dinner, speeches from employees and family members, a slideshow of photos spanning my life. Rachel organized it all, working with David and Lynn to make sure every detail was perfect. She gave a speech that night, telling the story of my journey from teenage factory worker to business owner, from someone who'd left school at 14 to someone who'd earned a college degree in middle age. But the part of her speech that meant the most came at the end, when she talked about her own journey. I was so focused on escaping where I came from, she said, that I almost missed the value in it. I was embarrassed by my mother's work, by our modest life, by everything that made me different from my wealthy classmates. It took her calling me out, forcing me to see what I was doing, for me to understand that I was the one who needed to change, not her. She was always enough. I just needed to grow up enough to see it. Looking around that room at all the people who'd become part of my life, the employees who trusted me with their livelihoods, the students who'd learned alongside me, the family who'd supported and challenged me, I understood something profound. Rachel's cruel words at her graduation hadn't destroyed me. They'd freed me. They'd forced me to stop measuring my worth by her achievements and start building my own. The pain had been necessary, the catalyst for transformation I might never have undertaken otherwise. I stood to thank everyone for coming, for being part of my journey. I talked about the unexpected paths life takes, how the moments that break us can also remake us into something stronger. I looked at Rachel, now in her 30s, successful in her own right, but measured by her own values rather than society's narrow definitions. I looked at David, my partner through everything, his faith in me never wavering. I looked at my granddaughter, already showing signs of the fierce independence that ran through the women in our family. My life didn't look like I'd imagined when I was young, marrying David and dreaming of a simple happy family. It had been harder, more painful, more complicated. But it had also been richer, more meaningful, more authentically mine. I'd learned that sacrifice without self-respect becomes martyrdom, that love without boundaries enables cruelty, that change is possible at any age if you're willing to do the work. The factory, the degree, the repaired relationship with Rachel, these were all external markers of internal transformation. The real change was in how I saw myself, how I valued my own experience and knowledge, how I refused to accept less than I deserved from anyone, including my own daughter. Years later, when Rachel's daughter Margaret asked me to tell her about my life, I didn't sugarcoat the difficult parts. I told her about leaving school, about the hard years of factory work, about the pain of her mother's rejection, and the courage it took to change my circumstances. I told her because I wanted her to understand that life rarely follows a straight line, that setbacks can become setups for something better, that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. She listened with her grandmother's intensity, absorbing every word. When I finished, she asked, "Were you mad at Mom for what she said at her graduation?" I thought about that question carefully before answering. I was hurt, I told her honestly. And angry, yes. But that hurt and anger became fuel for change. Sometimes the people who wound us most deeply are the ones who push us toward our greatest growth, even if that wasn't their intention. Little Margaret nodded seriously, processing this wisdom in the way children do, storing it away for when she'd need it later. I watched her, this child who carried my name and my legacy, and I felt grateful. Grateful for the hard journey that brought me here. Grateful for the pain that taught me my strength. Grateful for the daughter who broke my heart, and then helped me build something better from the pieces. My life had been a masterpiece of resilience, sewn together from scraps of hardship and determination, cut from fabric of experience and wisdom, finished with the careful stitches of self-respect and love. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd earned, and that made it beautiful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.